To the next session of the first day. And this time, the talk will be delivered by Dr. Vijay Patil, who is a consultant medical oncologist at Tata Memorial Center, Mumbai. And he will be talking about protocol writing with special emphasis on how to write the introduction, background, and objectives of a study protocol. Over to you, Dr. Vijay Patil.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah, very well. Yes.
Okay. So, thank you, Dr. Gota sir and Dr. Sudeep for giving me this opportunity. Actually, I was tensed when I looked at the program to talk after Dr. Kumar, after Dr. Indranil, and followed by Dr. Gary Clark, who all are excellent orators. Actually, had made me a bit nervous. So, pardon for my not so excellent orator skills, but I'll try to fit in what has been the way I write the introduction, the way I put the background and objective for my protocols. I don't have any conflicts of interest for this discussion. And I will be telling this a whole discussion with two stories. One will be a protocol of metronomic in gallbladder cancer, and one will be a recent protocol which I developed for leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. So one of the most important things whenever you want to do research and when you think about writing the background of a study is to do good literature search. And this lesson I was taught when I was writing a protocol for metronomic in gallbladder cancer. This was in 2014 when I was not a part of Tata. I was in an institute called Malabar Cancer Center. And for gallbladder cancer, taking a leaf out of head and neck cancer, I wanted to do a metronomic study. So I went through biological data and I saw that after doing a good PubMed search, that there's good data that low dose capecitabine does well in gallbladder cancer. After doing much further search on PubMed and on Google Scholar, I got that there are occasional reports and a retrospective study which showed that capecitabine has showed promising results in advanced gallbladder cancers. Further going ahead, I got a phase 2 study showing that yes, it shows promise in advanced gallbladder cancer. After further search, and by that time this is nearly 1.5 to 2 hours of searching for data, I actually came across a phase 3 study. And as Dr. Indranil had pointed out, quite frequently phase 2 studies show good results, but phase 3 studies don't replicate it. I found that this was actually had been done by an investigator in Brazil. It was already published. It was not published in a well-renowned journal, and hence it took time for me to find out. The moral of the story is that if you get an idea, at least multiple people across the globe would have had the same idea prior to you or would be having the same idea after you also. So always do a good literature search whenever you have a good idea to see whether what is the status of research on that question before embarking on even writing the complete protocol. And I was, because when you look at results, you do an incomplete search or you don't do a search at all, you might write the whole protocol, might go to the IC just to find out that within few months someone else might be publishing those results similarly. So what are the things which help you to write a good protocol? What I do is, a good friend of mine, Dr. Shantam Chakravarti, introduced to me to this website around 5 to 6 years back, and I follow this, the Equator.network. It gives reporting guidelines for all kinds of studies. And for study protocols, I would suggest you to follow the SPIRIT guideline. It's a SPIRIT statement, but published in British Medical Journal in 2013, and it's an excellent article which tells you what component should be there in a protocol, and what you must have in each component, and what at least needs to be defined in that component. So when you see about introduction, what SPIRIT suggests is that you describe your research question, you give justification why you want to do this study, and also you give the relevant evidence, both published and unpublished, justifying this evidence and providing the benefits and harm of the interventions which you are going to consider. So let's look at it. The first thing which you do before even thinking about writing a background is doing a good research, literature search. And you can follow the principles given by Prisma for doing a good systemic review, because according to me, when you're trying to do write a research protocol in any, your research should be as good as writing a good review article on that topic. What I do is I do look for published literature in PubMed and Google Scholar. Quite a few times, actually, research from India doesn't get published in good PubMed index journals, and you lose out this nationally important research when you do this, when you restrict your research to only PubMed. So I recommend doing an advanced PubMed research, doing a good Google Scholar research. Understand that every research which gets done doesn't get published instantaneously. There's a lag between the articles getting published. So it's important that you look at conference proceeding for last 2 years at least, before embarking on the question, to find out whether someone has already answered this question and has presented in these conferences, and very soon you may have a publication of this. So being a medical oncologist, I stick to ASCO and ESMO and to the specialty conference. For example, I practice neuro, head and neck and lung. So for neuro, I would look at the SNO conference proceeding. For head and neck, in addition to ASCO, ESMO, I look at the EHS and EHNS proceedings. For lung cancer, I will look at the WCLC, where again important abstracts, original articles are published, and this is very important. Another thing which you do is, if you have got an idea and if you see that the PubMed search shows that no one is doing it, you have got the background information, conference proceedings shows that no one is doing it, you are ready to go, do a good research for looking at if anyone is already doing this trial. And where this helps is the clinical trial registries. Understand that NCI, that clinicaltrialgov.in, which is given with the National Cancer Institute, most of the good researchers would have their trials registered. In fact, in India, it is mandatory. And in fact, even by it is mandatory that before you start your protocol, you should register your trials at one of the WHO recommended registries. So doing a research at these sites tells you what is the state, if anyone is answering the same question, and what is the status of the recruited, whether they have completed the recruitment. You may very well be part of that study itself with that person who was already answering the same question, to help him out to finish the recruitment fast. So clinicaltrialgov.in. For those who do research in India, few of us do register a trial at clinicaltrial.gov.in, but like what Tata IEC recommends, and most of the IECs which they recommend, is that registering the trial at Clinical Trial Registry of India. So also do a search at Clinical Trial Registry of India. I'll show you the portals to look for whether someone is doing these trials or not. Understand that all trials do not come in clinicaltrialgov.in. Australia, China, and a few other countries have their own clinical trial registries, like that is there for India, which is again WHO recommended. So it's also good to look at the WHO at WHO website. There is a search engine which allows you to look at all these sites together. It's good to have a look at these sites also if anyone else is looking at the similar questions. Important thing is, have a look at your own data. Like if you want to do a research in, let's say, leptomeningeal carcinomatosis, have a look at what is the number of patients you got in last 5 years, what was the pattern of treatment which you gave, what were the outcomes there in this situation. It helps you a lot. I'll come back to this point, how your own data helps you a lot. Understand that do PubMed search using the PubMed Advanced Search Builder. It helps. And remember to keep a copy of this record. Good journals like Lancet especially will ask you for the PubMed search details which you did before the protocol was written, and what were the reasons why you did this study. So keep a copy of this PubMed search. There are good YouTube videos, if you don't know, which will teach you how to do a good PubMed Advanced search. Whenever you do PubMed Advanced Search, you will get a lot of articles. There are multiple filters will help you to focus your research. Like for example, looking only at human species, looking articles published in English language, restricting yourselves to clinical trials, excluding case reports, excluding review articles. If you want to do that way, I would recommend you to be as exhaustive as possible in your first initial search. Then learn how to use this filter so that you can optimize your search engines when you do this kind of search. This is the portal for clinicaltrialgov.in. Again, if you put your condition, you put the keywords of drugs which you or radiation or whatever you want to investigate and put a search, you will get all the studies which are going in that on that situation, and you can actually check whether someone else is doing this research or not. Coming up to this, I told you that the second story which I will go along this is leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. So a few around 2 years back, we actually had a look at our own data of leptomeningeal carcinomatosis, and we found that our outcomes were very dismal. And this is what, when I did a good PubMed search, I understood that this is what the outcomes in even in Western countries are. As Dr. Indranil also specified, immunotherapy is coming up in a big way. And then I thought to myself, why not try giving intrathecal immunotherapy to these patients? And I started doing PubMed search for seeing whether if anyone has given intrathecal immunotherapy for leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. And I got 1 or 2 case reports. I didn't got any series. I understood that probably if I want to go ahead with this project, I need to do a phase 1 study. I went ahead and did a clinicaltrialgov.in search for intrathecal immunotherapy, and I struck one of the investigators, Dr. Zia in MD Anderson, was doing the same study, the same phase 1 study, studying the 3+3 design, looking at the dose of nivolumab in leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. This was in around June 2019. I emailed her if what is the status, because it was showing the recruiting of her study, and she emailed back saying that she cannot disclose the results at present, but the trial will be completing in next 1 or 2 months, and she would be presenting the results in very near future. In December 2019, actually the trial completely recruited, and this presented her results and giving us the maximum tolerable dose of nivolumab which could be administered intrathecal. Again, the moral of the story is that please always do a thorough research, because if not, you would be repeating the same things again and again, and which won't take science forward. Now, this is this portal for the WHO clinical trial trial registry, where you can look at simultaneously at all clinical trial registries. Most of these registries, like those of the Australian and the Chinese, get updated every weekly. Those like Indians, they get updated every 4 weekly at this site. Now, understand what your background should tell you. The background should tell you what question you are asking. So I'll go back to that story of leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. So when I did the good PubMed search for leptomeningeal carcinomatosis, I realized that one of the focus what I wanted to do was to give intrathecal nivolumab. And after I saw the results of from the MD Anderson investigators, I decided that maybe we could run a phase 2 study of giving intrathecal immunotherapy in leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. And what the first thing which, when I discuss it with my colleagues, and we have a good team of Dr. Kumar, Dr. Vanita, and who always guide me, is the first thing is how would it be feasible for you to get nivolumab? Nivolumab is costly, and around 40 to 50,000 Indian rupees per vial. So if every patient requires 2, 3, 3, 4 vials for intrathecal treatment, then it may not be feasible for to do this research at all. So I dropped that idea. But when I did the research, I came across that there's very limited evidence to actually show that intrathecal itself works in leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. Then I decided, let me ask this question first, that does actually intrathecal methotrexate helps in patients with leptomeningeal carcinomatosis? Now, in whom would you do this kind of research? Now, I selected a population after looking at the literature that lets me select a population in whom I have good systemic therapies which cross the blood-brain barriers. I do look at lung as a site, and I suggest that lung has a good percentage of patients who develop leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. It's rare, but around 5 to 10% of lung cancer patients develop. So I selected patients who are driver mutated and who are leptomeningeal carcinomatosis will be a good population for such kind of a study. And this was possible because of the PubMed research which was done. Where in the disease history would you be focusing on your intervention and the compared term. Understand that you can do it in the curative setting, you can do it in the first line setting, in the second line setting, in the third line setting. So be very specific. Interventions which are there in the first line setting, you cannot accrue patients of second line setting. So be very clear in your background discussion in which population you want to focus. So for example, leptomeningeal carcinomatosis, I wanted to do in patients who have not been previously treated. When exactly will be the interventions done? Whether the intervention will be done at the start, or like for example, like if you're planning a study in which you want to look for a combination of chemotherapy with radiation, and let's say in head and neck cancer, you want to do it before the radiation, you want to do with the radiation, or you want to do it after the radiation has got completed. So that again, the background search will help you out. Where is the more the evidence that this kind of gelling together between chemo and radiation is going to help in that situation? Which interventions which you will be doing in this study? Like if you want to give chemo with radiation in a head and neck cancer, and let's say that on the data you selected that I will give chemo and radiation together, which type of chemo will be the best to be tested against radiation? That again, your background research is going to tell you. You need to also address what are the likelihood of benefits and likelihood of harm when you have this with the experimental approach. And one of the important thing is why you want to ask this question. And as I told you, first check before writing the protocol if anyone else is doing this. And another thing, understand that research takes time. Developing protocols takes time. Submitting to the ethics takes time. After the ethics, achieving a funding takes time. Running the research takes time, and publication also takes time. Would the question be relevant after your research has got completed? Another important thing is in big institute like Tata, you are not the only researcher. There are multiple researchers and you might be fighting for the same pool of patients. So always also have a look with your IEC portals with if someone else is doing any competing research, which will hamper or your this new question will hamper his research or not. It's not a good idea to have multiple competing trials being running at the same institute without thinking about how the proportion of patients are going to get divided. Now, why you do want to do research? Now, this is an important justification which you need to provide in your background. So I have divided this in 4 times. I mainly deal with interventional trials, so I focused it on intervention trials. I feel that it's easy to understand. Like for example, if some cancer has a poor prognosis, understand whatever best service you give, you are not going to overcome this results. Like for example, if APML, that is acute promyelocytic leukemia, those who are medical oncology around 30 years back had very poor prognosis. 1 year survival used to be of 10%. If no one would have done any research, the survival still would have been 1 year survival of 10%, in spite of doing excellent service, giving excellent care to the patient, whichever would have been standard. So to improve the prognosis of the patient, research is necessary. And because research was done in APML, and you would have ATRA coming in, arsenic coming in, today the 1 year survival has gone up to 90%. So you would be doing research for improvement of outcomes. You would have certain situations that outcomes are already satisfactory, but the current treatment provide lot of side effects that degrade the quality of life of the patients. So you will do research to see that how you can decrease the side effects or improve the quality of life of the patients. You could have multiple treatment options in certain situations. Like for example, you take vocal cord, T1, T2, M0, M0 vocal cord. You could do with radiation, you could do with laser. No one knows which among them is better. And that would be a good question to answer, which among these two standard things is actually a better options. Or this is very common situation which happens in India and especially happens in medical oncology side, that current treatments may be good, but they're unfeasible. Like for example, all the newer targeted therapies or immunotherapies which we get, that Dr. Kumar Prabhashi alluded to this morning, are applicable for less than 1% of our patients. So how do you improve the outcomes in 99% of our patients who cannot afford this therapy, which are costly? Now, another important thing which you do is feasibility of doing the research. You don't include this into background, but you need to work out in your mind when you are writing a protocol. How, let me say that example, leptomeningeal carcinomatosis. Let me say that I have a sample size of 400 for this study. Am I going to get 400 patients? In last 5 years, I have got only 40 patients. When I put it for the study, please divide it by 4. This was a formula which was given to me by Dr. Gary Clark in 2012 when he was mentoring me in Accord, that if you have 10 patients coming in your clinic, divided by 4, only 2 or less than that would be agreeing for the research. Though all patients are not going to give consents. So how would you have that enough human resource to actually carry out the study? Monetary resource is another important question. Like this, I dropped the idea of doing intrathecal nivolumab and leptomeningeal calcimides because I was not very sure that in this current situation of COVID pandemic, anybody or intramurally, I'm going to get funds of crores of rupees for doing this research. Important thing, and this was Dr. Indranail also alluded to very nicely, look at the time resource. For example, if you're doing a study in curative setting, I'll give an example of my own. In our neuro DMG, we are running a phase 3 study in oligodendroglioma and grade 2, grade 3 and grade 2, grade 3 astrocytomas, where we are comparing temozolomide versus PCV as an adjuvant therapy. Now, we initially wanted overall survival as the endpoint, but the median overall survival of these patients is around 12 to 15 years. It would take us decades and decades to recruit patients and to reach that point, or the sample size be so huge that this study won't have been feasible. So we made PFS as the endpoint, which is a good surrogate for overall survival in this situation, and which can be achieved in 3 to 5 years. The event would have happened. So we could do the study in a very feasible manner in small number of patients. So always look at the time resource, especially if you are doing studies in cancers which are very aggressive, like leptomeningeal calcinomatosis, platinum refractory head and neck cancer. I would suggest go for overall survival. The median overall survival in these patients is very less. You could actually go ahead with a gold standard here. But you are doing research in situations where overall survivals are medians are beyond 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, it would be a good jugglery to go for progression-free survival or disease-free survival. As a look what innovation you want to do in this research, and you need to mention that in your protocol, because that is one of the things which the funders are looking at. So your background actually is telling you what the question, what you want to ask, giving scientific and ethical justification for the question. Ethical comes in when you discuss the harms and benefits and what benefit it would have. You're giving the comparative benefits and harm of the intervention. And this information is what actually your ethics people are looking at when your reviewer is looking at your protocol. This information also is been looked by the funders when they are trying to fund your protocol, how innovative it is, how much helpful it is going to be for the patients. And some part of this information you also put in a very simplified language in your layman summary and in your consent for the patient to understand. Let me go across how I would do a search and give you an example how practically I actually did. This is a protocol I developed over last 2 weeks to help me, because when I got this topic, I was not very clear like how should I approach the topic. Then I decided that let me write a protocol which I was supposed to write, and whatever I do while putting the protocol, I'll put it in the lecture. So I did a good PubMed search for this. Look at what relevant articles you have. Read those articles. So when I read the articles of leptomeningeal carcinomatous, I came across that poorest patients, they don't benefit from any kind of therapy, and the best treatment for them will be best supportive care. So I use this information that I would be only including patients which have good risk in this study. Poorest patients will be excluded from this study. And I came across that the recommended treatment is systemic management and intrathecal therapy. Most of the guidelines, everyone suggested that intrathecal therapy needs to be given in patients who have leptomeningeal carcinomatosis, thus justifying why I wanted to give intrathecal therapy. But when I looked at the data in more details, I found 2 randomized studies. Obviously, leptomeningeal carcinoma is rare, so you're not going to get big patients. One done in 2004 in breast cancer, which suggested that intrathecal chemotherapy did not benefit overall survival, did not lead to an improvement in neurological issues. A similar study done in 2020 did show that probably had some benefit in leptomeningeal progression-free survival, but overall progression-free survival and overall survival were still negative, suggesting that though intrathecal is a part of all guidelines, actual evidence suggests that it may not be beneficial. Understand that intrathecal itself is a painful procedure. It's an uncomfortable procedure. You need to give this injection once a week for 4 weeks, and then twice a week for the next 8 injections, and then once a month for the next 4 months. So if this procedure is not giving any benefit to the patients, the life expectancy of this patient is limited. Why not I give away with this uncomfortable procedure at all? Maybe this may lead to less harm to the patient. It may improve the quality of life of these patients. I looked for whether there was a randomized study in lung cancer, couldn't find one. But what I got is that in driver mutated lung cancer also, there was a big data set suggesting that there's no benefit of intrathecal therapy. Now, the good thing is that for those who are not medical oncologists here, that we in lung cancer, around 40 to 50% of patients are driver mutated, which means they have some mutation which drives the cancer. We have drugs which can be given orally, and they can overcome these cancers. And you may be surprised that the survival of stage 4 lung cancer, which was less than 1 year around a decade back, now has gone to 5 years and 6 years when you can treat this patient appropriately with with what we gave is called tyrosine kinase inhibitors. These are specific inhibitors which go and inhibit this cancer. So a vast improvement in outcomes has been achieved. And because there's a vast improvement in outcomes, now this patient actually failed at century sites, brain, and the leptomeninal is one of them. Good thing is that most of this tyrosine kinase inhibitors penetrate the CSF as opposed to the standard chemotherapy. And the CSF to plasma penetration ratios are reasonably good. And there is evidence also that when you give only RLOT in EGFR mutated lung cancer, 30% clearance can be achieved with similar outcomes that we would achieve by giving intrathecal. Evidence that osimertinib, a third generation TKI, when given, leads to better results, better response rates, and leads to an improvement in outcome. So there were these multiple justifications to suggest that even if you don't give intrathecal therapy, especially in driver mutated non-small cell lung cancer, which is the target population for my study, they won't be harmed by not giving intrathecal therapy. Might be the quality of life might get improved with this. Similar evidence we also have in ALK. This is another next common type of, so when you look at driver mutated, the most common in India is EGFR, then it's ALK, then it's ROS and MET. ALK also we have good evidence that there is a good penetration by this TKI inside the CSF. So what I did, I justified my comparators. That is the second important thing which Spirits tells you to do in your protocol. You justify the choice of comparators, the way you are going to give them, why are you going to give them, and also talk about the side effects and benefits. Now, understand it's very important that your choice of comparator has to be good. If you have a weak standard arm, you give unjustifiable advantage has been given to the experimental arm. If you have an inappropriately high dose standard arm, you're unethical it is, as most of the patients will be having high adverse events. Understand the choice of arms which you're going to choose and keep a watch why you want to use it. For example, if you have a best supportive care arm, recruitment of your studies is going to be very slow. Understand the results and the interpretation of the studies are heavily dependent upon the choice of your intervention arm. So if you're not going to choose a standard arm or you're going to give a weak standard arm, it impacts the interpretation, it will impact the results, and it will impact the interpretation of your results. So a good background discussion should have justification of why you choose the comparator or experimental arm, why you choose the comparator arm, that is the standard arm also, specifying what dose you are going to use, and giving the justification or the evidence of why you did that. So in summary, your background should give justification for the question, should give justification for the comparator, justification for the disease and the situation in which you are going to do, and it should give justification for the design also. Let's discuss upon why it needs to give a justification for design. And this is what I learned across writing a number of protocols when they came back from the IRB and the fund giving agencies for giving justifications, asking for designs. And then I realized that no, it's good to put this in the background. For example, if I have two arms in which I want to see which among them is better, or one arm has good high amount of side effects, one arm and less amount of. I'll give a practical example like weekly, 3 weekly study which Dr. Kumar showed in the morning, which was Dr. Vanita Narana was the principal investigator of the study. Weekly arm, more need of, we knew that for experience, more side effects, more hospitalization. Weekly, most of the Indians were comfortable, less side effects, less chance of hospital. Now, when you want to compare this, you would go for a non-inferiority design. You would be okay compare you. It's not, you don't want the weekly arm to be superior than the 3 weekly arm to start using it in the standard practice. A slight non-inferiority, not slight non-inferiority assumptions, which could be clinically relevant and would be justifiable considering the side effects, would be the appropriate way of going in this situation. So understand, if you're comparing two standard of cares or two standard of cares where uh, one of them has side effects, one of them has less side effects, or one of them is more feasible to give in any way. It may be cheaper, it might be oral. Non-inferiority design would be an appropriate option. But understand, when you use non-inferiority designs, most of the times the patient numbers required are huge. So if you are doing something in rare tumors or in situations where number of patients are going to be rare, choosing a non-inferiority design, even if you maybe seem scientifically more correct, may not be the feasible option. You would like to give a justification for the objectives, like Dr. Indranil suggested. In curative setting, going for OS might be a difficult option. I would just reframe that statement saying in curative setting where OS are long, it might not be a justifiable option. Like for example, if you take CA esophagus, it's considered curative locally in the advanced esophagus, but the RTOG results when you do radical RT or radical CTRT, the survival is only 9 to 12 months. In that situation, you would go for an overall survival. So when you expect that the event rate for overall survival are going to be long enough, then you start using a surrogate endpoint. And please see that that surrogate actually is a surrogate for your overall survival. And that needs to again get justified in the background. It's good to give a justification for any extra procedures also if you're going to do. Like for example, in leptomeningeal carcinomatosis, my plan is to give tyrosine kinase inhibitor in one arm, tyrosine kinase inhibitors plus intrathecal in one arm. I would be actually interested in knowing when I give oral tyrosine kinase inhibitors, what would the plasma CSF levels in these patients? So I would actually go for doing PKPD studies to see if I can actually give some idea about what are the CSF plasma levels. Would it be an extra procedure for the patient? And this needs to be ethically justified. No, I would do that only in the arm in which I'm giving intrathecal. As many of you who are given intrathecal, you know when you give intrathecal, you actually allow 1 to 2 ml of CSF to drain out. That actually is similar amount of volume in which whatever intrathecal, let's say that I'm going to give intrathecal methotrexate, 2.3 ml is been given. So I would drain out 1 to 2 ml and then I'll push 2.3 ml of CSF. So it would be very ethically justifiable that what I'm going to drain out, that is the drained out CSF I would be actually sending for my PKPD studies. Now, molecular analysis. One important aspect in leptomeningeal carcinoma is that no one has actually seen, we have very good data regarding what is the mutation in driver mutation patients at front. After treatment, what resistance mechanism they developed. We don't have any good data about sanctuary sites like brain or for the leptomeningeal changes. Understand that the levels of the drugs are different in the blood and it's different in the CSF. So the same amount of competition is not there for the mutation for what is extracranially as it is cranially. What I mean, the level, let's take example of osimertinib, the level of osimertinib's blood will be very high. So the kind of resistance which will develop extracranially will be different from the kind of resistance which will be likely to develop inside the brain where the level of the drug is very small. This is an hypothesis, but I don't have hardcore data to support that. As no one else has seen this, what are the molecular changes which have happened in the leptomeningeal cells. So one of the plan I would put in this study is doing molecular analysis from the CSF cytology at baseline and at progression to allow me to compare how different or how similar it's to what is seen extracranially, and what are the resistance mechanisms. That would be one of my quaternary endpoints in this for this study. The background also gives you the tells you about prognostic features, and this is an important aspect. I know that in leptomeningeal calcium, these are the prognostic features. These are then the important prognostic which I would give it to my statistician for doing stratification. It's important that you have appropriate stratification factors when given to your statistician for developing a randomization seat. How do you come to know which are the most important prognostic factors? These you come to know by doing a good literature search. Another important thing, and remember, you again need to keep the reference with you, is assumptions which you give to the statistician. You give an assumption like 1 year survival is 60%. I want to improve it by 20% because I consider that as clinically relevant. From where this 1 year overall survival came, please see that you write that in your protocol and keep the reference, because whenever you give it for a funder to the IEC, when you do the study, when it goes for the publication, everyone is going to ask you for reference from where the baseline assumption came, because the statistics, which is an important part of a protocol, one of the important fields is your baseline outcomes. Always try to see if any molecular data is there prior given in literature, which can again help you in finding out what molecular features you might want to test and what future molecular analysis you want to do in your study. Now, that's what I have talked about background. Dr. Indranil has already given a clear idea about objectives, and actually had discussed with Dr. Gota that there will be some overlap over my discussion over objectives with us. So I am going to restrict myself to how to draft the objectives in your protocol. He has already nicely discussed, so I'll just put some important aspects again. Now, when you write your hypothesis, it should be specific. And I'll give an example of this. You should define the purpose and the scope of your study, and it should be very closely tied with your design. For example, superiority study, you would normally use a null hypothesis. Non-inferiority, use a alternate hypothesis. Like for example, we go this. So in this study, intrathecal methotrexate addition to TKI won't lead to an improvement in three-month overall survival by 10% in driver mutated non-small cell lung cancer with leptomeningeal metastasis. So complete, it tells you about the intervention, it tells you about what is your primary endpoint, to what increment you are looking at, in which population and in which situation you are looking at. Understand that the hypothesis actually tells you about that you null will say that there is no difference, and it is closely tied to design and your analysis methods. Objectives, there are types. The primary objective is the one for which goes into a primary endpoint and for which the trial is powered. Other secondary, tertiary, and quaternary are the other objectives which are less and less relevant, as the quaternary is less relevant than tertiary is less relevant than secondary. Always draft the objectives with a neutral wording. And if you have multiple arms, clarify also in which way you are going to compare the arms in A. So for example, let's look at this objective. Primary objective will be in the leptomeningeal to compare the 3-month overall survival between the two arms. Now, quite a few would are surprised, why is the 3-month overall survival? And this is the important thing, that why you justify taking 3-month overall survival in your background. The median survival of this patients is around 60 to 90 days. And that's the reason that hardly any patient survives beyond 6 months. That's the reason why we chose to took 3-month overall survival. Secondary, and as I told you, that it would be quality of life, to compare the quality of life over the first 6 months between the two arms. Adverse events, to compare the maximum grade of adverse events between the two arms. You can see that I have not taken progression-free survival as an endpoint in the study. The reason is here is because, as Dr. Indranil had specified, that when you take progression like an endpoint, you should be very specific what you mean by progression. Unfortunately, in leptomeningeal metastasis, the progression is given by something called as RANO criteria. The RANO criteria, these are radiological criteria for assessment in neuro-oncology. They were given in 2017, but they have not got validated. So you can assess progression, but you are not very sure that your progression-free survival is a surrogate for overall survival or not. I want to assess the estimate the CSF2 blood level. So this is I have noted in the tertiary endpoint and quaternary endpoint. I want to see the molecular profile between the extracranial and the leptomeningeal mets, both at baseline and at progression. This is the way I would put my objectives, which are clear in a neutral manner, tell you about what exactly you are going to do. Last two slides, and these are tips from my side, because Dr. Vikram had told me that the investigators will be jumping in the waters of research for the first time. I had a good opportunity to work at Tata. There were good mentors around me, and this is what I learned from them. First, understand research is important. Without research, the outcomes of your patients are not going to improve. So actually, you are doing a disservice to the patients if you're not doing research. This is one of the fundamental things you understand. However, good service you provide as close as to standard of care. For example, pediatric AL, 5-year survival was 9%. If you would have said that we don't want to do research, we'll just provide good care, which was in accordance to literature, we would have still be stuck around here. This jumps in survival have happened only because research was done. So doing research is important. Doing research, if you're an academician, is your service. This is the best way you can treat your patients. Important. I play a lot of cricket. We do not get trained during our MD and DM properly in doing research. So when you do go for doing their first year, it's going to be a new track. It will be difficult. So my advice, if you have a senior along with you, a mentor along with you, who's already doing clinical research, get added up as a co-investigator in his studies and try and learn from his studies first that what you should be doing, what you should not be doing, how to do SAE reporting, how to do CRA completions. That information helps you out. For the first study, try to put as an observational study. It's easy to do. There are less chances of you making mistakes. It's easy to go via ethics. You would be happy that you did something and you could gain that confidence and then go for interventional studies. Keep your first study with limited resource requirement. Understand that you might want to go to Mars. You might require crores of money for that. If you don't have a credibility behind you, saying that you have done so much protocols have been completed, you are published in these journals, no one is going to give funding for you to do that. I still remember the first letter of rejection which I got from Wellcome Trust DBT. They actually showered praises on my protocols that it was written well. But the important line was the last, that you had a limited experience and we cannot fund you. And that is the hard truth. You might have a lot of promise, but till you bring your credibility good, you may not get funding at start, especially big budget funding. So first, bring up your credibility by doing small studies and then go for the big ones. So please, first, and investigators in India are different from investigators in US or UK. You are sole. Most of the times, you and your coordinator will be the only people who will be doing all research related activities. So understand that keep things small at the start so that you can handle them well. Expand it as when your team starts expanding. So initially you should have minimum manpower requirement, minimum funding. Choose situations where the results are likely to come fast. Understand first time you're bound to make mistakes. It can't happen that 10 years down the line, you are a good researcher when you look back at protocols which you wrote 10 years back and you say, oh, I made so many mistakes. If you say that I wrote the best protocol 10 years back, there is something very wrong with you. You must enjoy the process. And another advice, I have seen investigators, today they would be doing some research in breast cancer. Tomorrow, suddenly going in esophageal cancer. Next day, glioma. Don't do that. Open up your own niche. Do research step by step. Like for example, if I had to do research, I would look at palliative head and neck cancer, one paper looking at observation, next paper putting some intervention, doing a phase 1 for that, doing a phase 2 for that, doing a phase 3 for them. Again, starting with some new molecule, again going from a phase 2 to phase 3. So put your own niche for your research, and that would help you a lot even in your professional development. I need to acknowledge multiple peoples here. This is my last slide. And Dr. Kumar Babar sir, who was my thesis guide, I was his first student. He trained me. He allowed me to work on multiple products, gave me absolute free hand. Dr. Vanita Narona madam, who have been again have been very kind to me. She was my teacher. She's my now colleague and gives me free hand. Dr. Jalali sir, he's not a part of Tata now, but he was the one who trained me in neuro, taught me how to do research in neuro. Dr. Amit Joshi sir, Dr. Sachin Dhumal, he is my coordinator. He's a coordinator for our team. He's been there for 10 years, and let me tell you, he has brilliant ideas, knows his stuff very well. So very gem of a person. You should have a good statistician as your friend if you want to do research in India. Atanu Bhattacharya is that friend of mine. He's a PhD in statistics, very good. Right. You should be very good. We have personal relations and be friends with your scientists. And I have more than one. Dr. Bhota, Dr. Manoj Mahimkar sir, Dr. Anuradha Chaugule. These are the people who are going to help you to improve your protocols, improve the molecular aspects of your protocols. Learn from your colleagues. One of the initiations in my statistics was done way back in 2006 by Dr. Shantam Chakravarti. I learned a lot from him. I need to thank Dr. Gary Clark. He was the one, and in fact, even today when I have some difficulties in statistics, I pick your brains. Moral of the story is that you would be meeting your mentors right now after some time. Develop a long-term relationship with them if you want to be an academic or you want to do research. I need to thank Martin Stockler sir for developing a CORD program and today also coming here to give guiding us. I need to thanks my funders, patients and families, IEC and DSMB of TMH. Not all investigators are very happy always with IECs and DSMB, but Tata IECs and Tata DSMBs are completely different. They have allowed us to do many things in past. I believe that they would allow us to do many big things in future also. I need to thank my wife, Dr. Sampada Desai, because she puts up with me whenever I'm doing so much of looking at my research protocols. And that is my last slide. Thank you.